Welcome to AskPsychSessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thanks for joining us today. Our guest is a repeat guest. Dr. Valerie Taylor joined us this summer for our series on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'd encourage you to go back to episode 43 if you missed it. But today we've invited you back, hoping that we might expand on that conversation. So thanks for joining us from your home at Lehigh University.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about some things to think about for those of us that last semester maybe started to do some of this equity, diversity, and inclusion work in our courses, and maybe it did not land with unanimous enthusiasm. So could you talk a bit about how to deal with some pushback that you might be getting from students or from colleagues? Would you be willing to talk about that for a bit today?
Yes. It is true that it is a challenge sometimes to talk about these sorts of things, sexism, racism, homophobia, etc. And even if our students are fully on board, or we believe that they're on board, when the rubber hits the road, it can be difficult to really talk about some of the substantive issues of privilege and hierarchy in a way that students can really take it in and digest it. So I've experienced that myself, some backlash from students, both in class and in my evaluations.
So yes, let's start there. Even what do we do about this pushback? Let's just start with students. I would like us to get to other places where you might see pushback later, but let's start with students. What do you do about student pushback, either in the classroom or evaluations or both? Maybe you could talk about the process.
Yeah, I can. Well, from my experience, I'm an African-American Black woman. And when I teach, sometimes I get pushback because students may perceive me only speaking from my experience and not talking from research or from a body of work that has accumulated evidence of bias and discrimination in various places in the world. And so what I find particularly important is to always bring students back to the work and to the data, to the numbers. For some students, that's pretty powerful, especially we know in a Western context, this hard data can be compelling for students. So I don't like to stay there because I do believe that people's personal experiences matter as well. But you can really look at disparities and think about why they may be occurring, of course, but when you look at the raw data, that can help to bring students along, or at least to get them to open up. There's a bit of research actually on confronting racism that I find interesting in thinking about this. So the work in general shows that it's pretty hard for people to confront, especially when people are giving you pushback on sexist remarks or racism or other things like that. And if I can think about that in the context of teaching as well. But we do know that when people have an implicit theory of change or that incremental theory of personality, thinking about Carol Dweck's work, we know that they're more likely to confront or more likely to be open to changing or thinking that people can change. And so there's been some research that shows that you can actually remind students of this possibility of change, that the way things are really don't have to be this way forever, even though change is hard. And I find that kind of extrapolating this research to the classroom, that students also become more open to listening, because oftentimes they just feel attacked. They feel like when this data or this work is being discussed, it's a personal affront to them and what they perceive that they have earned. And this is particularly for white students. So adopting this mindset or helping them adopt this mindset of change and growth, I find particularly helpful for many of my students as well.
That is helpful and something, yes, to think about, that it can be hard to look at the data when you feel that the data are talking about you individually. So that is,
or your family or your group,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's tough.
Okay. So now that we've got the classroom seeming to go, okay, what about then when the evaluations, which especially for our colleagues that are, those evaluations are going to be more, have more of an impact for things like tenure and promotion evaluations. Have you ever had a student not appreciate this work and maybe comment about it in an evaluation? And do you have some strategies to recommend for our listeners about what to do with that information? Again, let's just sort of assume that this is constructive advice that we can do something about, right?
Yes, I have received pretty difficult feedback. And, as when we all get difficult feedback, we can read it and we have to take a breath or walk away. I, like everyone else, feels horrible after I see them the first time. Well, I actually taught a class in the spring. It was called The Doing and Undoing of Racism. And I received one particularly scathing evaluation that said that I showed preferential treatment to Black students in the class, that I didn't consider what other people thought, and that if we were actually going to read research that suggested that empathy was a good thing, that I needed to learn how to be empathic and change my ways. And it went on and on for paragraphs and paragraphs. So I really upset this student. And it was interesting because we also know that people of color have a really hard time being able to discuss this and be taken seriously. So it was tough feedback to receive. And I had to think about this in the context of the COVID situation, in the context of this student's own particular stress that they may have been experiencing. And so after just breathing a little bit, I had to first think about, like, what happened in that classroom? How did that happen? And I do know that there were only a few Black students in this class. And I do know that they did give a few personal experiences that lined up with some of the data. And if I heard that, I might have supported them in that comment. And thinking back on it, maybe this is what the student perceived as being partial to them, things like that. And so I don't know, in a sense, part of me has to know that I need to stick to my guns and present the work, I say, as objectively as possible. But in this case, emotions do arise. They do come into play. And sometimes this is the first place or the first forum where some students of color in particular, get to air some of the challenges that they've had in the education system or in the healthcare system, for example. And so thinking about how to support all students is not easy, right? So I can't say that I have all the answers, but I do know that it's pretty tough. What I think that I have to do a better job of myself, and as we all think about doing this work, is to continually remind people how triggering this work can be for us, how it can sort of put us on the defensive. But again, remind them, as I talked about earlier, about this ability to change and to grow, that we really have to wrestle with these hard things to sort of push past it to get to the better thing. And I talked last time about my favorite exercise metaphor. And so I really try to bring that up to students quite often, that when you talk about these things, it's really hard. It's really uncomfortable at first. It hurts, just as when we exercise or start to exercise the first time. And it could take a number of sessions talking through these issues to become a habit before the habit becomes easier. It doesn't mean that it's ever comfortable, but at least we know how to sort of manage our emotions and have these sorts of conversations that can be really difficult or feel targeting to us. Yeah, so it's tough though. It's really tough. The last thing I want to say though is that a lot of what the research also shows is that white faculty or white people and men can sometimes have an easier time getting this information across to their students because they are not perceived as subjective. They're perceived as more objective when they're presenting these facts. So I think it's really important for people who really consider themselves allies and really are looking to teach this work and integrate it into these courses to really make a point of bringing other voices in, decolonizing the syllabus, so to speak, bringing other experts in to speak from time to time, and also making sure that they are really standing up and confronting on behalf of their colleagues of color when they're dealing with students in this way, because they will often have an easier time changing or helping the student change to be more positive in that regard.
Thank you. Good reminder for me as I, fall into that category of having potentially an easier time appearing objective for these conversations. Although maybe we can take a little sidebar just for a minute, because the thing that then I try to be conscientious of in the class is not appearing to necessarily be able to fully understand. Like I don't want to give the impression to my students that I now think I've read enough books or listened to enough podcasts or gone to enough professional development sessions to actually be able to fully understand what it would be like to exist in a space where, all the things that you just talk about in your courses, are happening. That, I don't have to fight twice as hard to be heard in a meeting, for example. People don't, assume automatically that my tone is more aggressive than it is, things like that. So I guess maybe you could just, if you have any thoughts kind of on that balance of being an authority in the room without trying to imply, especially to my Black students, that I guess air quotes really get it. I'm trying to understand, but I would not want to say that I'm fully knowledgeable.
Yes, thank you for that. I remember when I was an undergrad, I truly appreciated it when professors just acknowledged exactly what you acknowledged. It sort of set the stage for us all being able to learn and grow. And it made me as a student feel more comfortable to share my experience and not necessarily feel like I was speaking for all Black people, for example, but could be open enough and know that my professor sort of would support me and value my statements there. And I did have this experience. I, in undergrad, took a class that sort of changed the trajectory of my research life. It was called Gender and Racial Attitudes. And the professor there was a white woman, and I loved her. I still love her to this day. And she was really good about having us talk through these issues, making sure that she was clear that though she didn't understand everything, she was doing what she could to understand and listening to different voices. And we kind of wrestle with all this work together. So I think just the acknowledgement goes a long way to a lot of students. And it really models the way to be a good ally to students who are still sort of learning how to do that well.
Thank you. So let's maybe use that to talk about more departmental level allyship, especially in the face of pushback, right? So,
yes,
these evaluations come in, students are grumpy. I haven't read the literature, but I would, assume that administrators sometimes, maybe this could be something that makes them more nervous or uncomfortable. What are some things we can be doing to create, departmental spaces so that faculty that are getting the pushback are supported to keep doing this work, as opposed to, kind of I would hope no one's asking anyone to tone it down, but maybe, consider an alternate model or make sure you're making space for all voices. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, a few. So I know that, well, hopefully this has just been a crazy time, right? So it's been hard to teach this stuff, but right now it feels particularly urgent, but it can be stressful nonetheless. And I would hope, first of all, that during this time of COVID, that we have a little bit of reprieve with our evaluations, because there's so many reasons that they can be terrible as we transition online and do all these sorts of things to to be good professors online. But as it relates to these courses and the responses we get from them now, I think it's just incumbent that we understand and we know from the literature that women and professors of color will receive lower evaluations on average. So the baseline is often just different. And going from there, we have to really think about what are the particular circumstances that these faculty are in when they're teaching content in general, but DEI content in particular, and how we can really stand up for them nonetheless. So I would say for faculty, make sure that you keep those really good notes from the students that enjoyed the course, enjoyed learning these new perspectives and being able to sort of apply them in their lives so that you can have some of this as evidence, because usually we have this bimodal distribution, right? And then once it gets averaged, it doesn't look so great. So if we can sort of show evidence of our impact nonetheless, I think that is important as well. And also, when we're writing, like I'm thinking about writing our annual reviews or our tenure portfolios, really talking about the strategies that we've used to integrate this content into our courses and explaining, even citing work that talks about the pushback or the challenges that will occur and how you have sort of pushed through that or circumvented some of those things to really do the work that's necessary in this particular time. And so I think it is a little bit of work that we sometimes have to do, but I think it's important work for us to really take seriously that we're going to do this nonetheless and show why it's important and how it's important. And I think from there, when we're talking to our chairs and to the administrators, I think people are starting to get on board and understand the situation, and that it even takes practice for us to learn how to teach in this way well as we update our syllabi and update our projects and activities in class. You know, it takes a little bit of trial and error. So also it may take a couple of runs of the course before we feel comfortable that we've gotten a handle on how to teach these concepts well and integrate them well.
Great. And those are really good nuggets as I'm thinking about the things that I do where I can echo those facts to remind people. So if I'm I'm on a rank and tenure committee, making sure I'm explicit in the teaching evaluation section that the data show these courses tend to, ratings tend to be lower. So I think that's a nice reminder that we have data on this to use to affirm what the candidate is discussing. So thank you. And yes, give yourself if it doesn't go well. I think that's a point I want to echo too. For people that just tried this last semester, if it didn't go well, that doesn't mean to abandon it, but rather It means that it's going to take, as you said, right, the exercise metaphor, like you said, the planks are going to hurt.
Yes.
Keep planking. You'll get stronger.
Yes.
So if you're up for it, I would like to kind of end our chat today with a little bit of talking about how this also plays into the scholarship space. So we've talked about teaching, but most of our listeners, I think, are also engaged in scholarship here. And I get a sense sometimes that maybe this work has the same pushback issues as you might see in the classroom, and that it's not necessarily as understood because, maybe it's more qualitative or maybe it's interdisciplinary. So is that instinct seem viable to you? And if so, do you have some thoughts about what we can do with it?
Yes, I do. So it is true. I think we're still, as a field, trying to figure out exactly where scholarship or diversity science scholarship really fits. And when people write about it, it could be a challenge for some to understand how it might stack up, so to speak, to other work that we may be doing. I just want to first reiterate, just in the same way that the teaching of psychology, that scholarship matters for how we do our work and to do it well, I want to suggest that scholarship of diversity science matters just as much. And I know that it could take a while for everyone to get on board, but we just all want to start from that premise that it matters. And it not only matters for the science or the teaching, but it really matters to the students that we have in our classrooms whose lives are impacted by these topics daily, right? And so we've seen sort of the disparities. We know well about these disparities in education, in health, at COVID, for example. And so I think it's important to always remember this larger goal that we're here to teach our students, teach them well, introduce them to research, but they have to see themselves there, right? We know from a lot of work that there's this utility value that matters quite a lot for students of color and underrepresented students in particular. And they must sort of see the connection between the real world and the value of the work that we're doing and how it connects to other things outside of sometimes just the simple basic science. And this is important because we have a diversifying world and country. We're educating more and more diverse students every day. And so taking their experiences into account is really important. I also think it's important to keep in mind who our audience is and to explain that to our reviewers, for example, in our tenure packets and our annual review packets. We want to explain who we're writing to, why we're writing to them, and we can situate the work that we're doing if we're publishing in this area, for example, by providing a bit of explanation there. And so I think doing these things could really help to elevate the science and make it, get it to a point where we can integrate it through our teaching and our scholarship in a more seamless fashion.
I have so many adjectives I want to use right now. So now I'm going to pick none of them except to say, I'll go with wow, because, I really heard that reminder that I need sometimes, that it is so important for our students to see themselves in this work. And that I just read, like a little write-up of a study saying that we don't, when we're studying, white Americans, we never put that in the title of our article. But we put other groups in the title of articles and, the impact that has.
Yes.
And why that's meaningful. So that's those sort of pieces coming together right now with what you said. And yeah, it's really imperative that we have scientifically a full understanding of the world, but these are also human beings in our classes that are more than just their thoughts about the content material. So thank you for that really critical reminder. And just that, diversity makes things better. If we know more,
yes.
It's better, right? This is not, we
Yes.
shouldn't just be reluctantly inviting diversity. We should be thrilled to have diversity because things are better.
Yes, it's better, but people have to remember that better doesn't necessarily mean easy. And I think the minute that things don't come easy to us, we assume it's not better, or we assume that it's not profitable, or it's not worth the time because we could be doing something where we can, quote unquote, see the proof in the pudding immediately. And this again is the sort of work that takes time and maturation. And for us to get we can't expect our students to get comfortable with it if we ourselves are not comfortable with it, And so I think that's why the practice is so important, so that we can all become models for our students as they're sort of looking towards us to understand how to digest everything we're seeing and reading and hearing and being bombarded with. How do we digest this information? And so we have a huge responsibility. I mean, most of us came into this profession because of how much we love psychological science and see it being really impactful in our lives, cognitively, culturally, etc. And so I think this is our moment really to infuse these diverse perspectives into our work and make sure that we are remembering the students who are sometimes forgotten as well.
That is an excellent end note. So thank you again, Valerie, especially for being willing to come back and expand. I've been talking with Valerie Jones Taylor from Lehigh University.